Sir, this section is for designated family only. Please step back, or we'll have to ask you to leave. The cold voice echoed through the brightly lit auditorium. The silver-haired man stood still on his shoulders, hung an old Marine Corps dress jacket, its edges frayed, its brass buttons dulled by time. He did not react. He did not argue. Instead, he quietly reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded card creased neatly at every corner. On it, in trembling but proud handwriting, were the words, "Dad, I want you in the front row." No one noticed. The laughter, the click of cameras, the bright bouquets, everything went on as if he didn't exist. Only 6 men in the 5th row saw what had just happened. They sat in silence, their eyes cold as steel. Then, as the first chair scraped slightly against the floor, that small sound of metal on tile sliced through the room, and in an instant, the entire hall fell silent. No one knew what was happening yet, but they were about to witness a moment when honor and gratitude would awaken in a world that had forgotten how to bow. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have already walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and join us in preserving the memory, the dignity, and the reverence for the quiet heroes among us. The music began to rise inside the auditorium, that familiar orchestral theme every graduation seems to share. Applause, cheers, the clicking of cameras blended into a single sound of celebration. But amid the waves of joy and color, there was one man who did not move. The old silver-haired Marine, the one who had been asked to leave the front rows, remained standing beside the red-lit exit sign. The dim light painted shadows across his weathered face. His Marine Corps dress jacket was frayed at the shoulders, the brass buttons scratched and dull. Beneath that worn fabric, his posture stayed perfectly straight, shoulders squared, head lifted as if his body had long forgotten how to bow. His hands were folded behind his back, still as stone. Every so often, his thumb brushed the edge of a small card tucked inside his breast pocket, a fragile piece of paper that had followed him all morning. He didn't bring it to prove a right to sit. He brought it to keep a promise to his son. Spotlights swept across the stage inside the hall. Black graduation caps shimmered faintly under the soft blue glow. Groups of students lined up, certificates in hand, smiling for cameras. No one noticed the man by the wall. He had become part of the air itself, invisible quiet. Only the faint red light from the exit sign glimmered across the dark blue fabric of his uniform, catching the Marine Corps insignia on his chest, a muted bronze glow, steady and dignified. In the 5th row, a woman named Linda Monroe tilted her head. She had been watching him since the moment he appeared. Among the crowd of beaming faces of laughter and flashbulbs, it was only this man she could not look away from. She could feel the stillness in his breathing, see the depth in his gaze eyes that didn't look at the stage but through it as though they were fixed on something far beyond. Something sacred. Something that belonged to memory, not spectacle. Then Linda understood this man wasn't lost, nor out of place. He wasn't standing there because he'd been turned away. He stood there because he was waiting for something he could not miss, something holy. His silence wasn't submission. It was reverence. Reverence for his son about to cross a threshold into his own life, and maybe reverence for all those he had once seen cross into the smoke and never come back. The music carried on. A student's name was called, applause, handshakes, smiles, then another and another. Cheers filled the air, bright and careless. Each burst of laughter made the contrast starker between the noise and that lone, unmoving figure by the wall. Linda felt it sharply now in all this celebration. Silence was the only thing that demanded respect. The security guard by the door kept glancing toward him, but eventually stopped. The man wasn't causing trouble. He just stood there, as if the whole world could move on without him, and still he would remain. A soldier once accustomed to standing watch amid chaos was now guarding something infinitely smaller the moment his son would take the next step of his life. Linda sensed it before anyone else. Something was building beneath the surface. Not anger, not defiance, but a quiet dignity so heavy it made those who noticed it feel smaller in its presence. She looked around, hoping someone else might see, but no. The crowd was still busy snapping photos, laughing, checking their phones. They did not see the veteran standing against the wall, just as they rarely see men like him in real life, the ones who quietly built the peace they take for granted. A soft gust slipped through the side door. The paper in his pocket fluttered. He closed his hand around it, his gaze still fixed on the stage. The announcer's voice called one name after another. He didn't blink. His breathing stayed steady, slow, measured, as though he were counting down in his mind. Light from above caught on the row of brass buttons, making them gleam like old metals awakened. Linda exhaled softly. Shame filled her chest, shame for every time she'd walked past someone like him in the world outside and never looked twice. That kind of silence didn't need pity. It only asked to be seen. And that morning she knew with certainty this man would not leave. No matter what anyone said, he would stand there until his son's name was called. No one else knew it, but that silence was beginning to shift the room itself like a tide rising quietly beneath the surface. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It only waited. For one word, one careless sentence, to turn stillness into strength. And it was at that very moment when the first mocking voice rose from the stage that everything began to change. A sharp, cold voice rang out again, this time closer, clearer, carrying the tone of practiced contempt. "Sir, this area is reserved for real families." The young staff member spoke without looking him in the eye. Her gaze fixed on the checklist pen, tapping lightly, as though inspecting a package that didn't belong. The words seemed small, but in that moment they struck like a blow against his dignity. The old man said nothing. Around him the hall was alive with laughter phones, ringing heels, clicking on the polished floor. A group of students shouted for a photo, tossing their caps into the air. No one paid attention to the silver-haired man standing quietly by the wall. No one at all. The first security guard stepped forward, his voice flat and mechanical. "Sir, please step to the back. This section is for invited guests only." The man nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the stage. His voice was low, steady, but clear. "My son invited me here. He wanted me in the front row." The second guard raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an invitation?" The old man slowly reached into his pocket and drew out a worn card, its corner softened by time. Written in faint blue ink, the shaky but deliberate words read, "Dad, I want you in the front row." The young woman glanced at it, then shook her head. "No official signature." "I'm sorry, sir." He didn't respond. Not a word in protest. He simply folded the card back along its creases and placed it against his chest, the left pocket right over his heart. A small gesture, but it made the air around him grow heavy, thick as fog. The scene unfolded in the middle of a sea of celebration. Linda Monroe saw it all and felt something tighten inside her chest. She could hear laughter ahead, a whisper or two behind her, probably wandered in by mistake, maybe part of the cleaning crew. The careless words cut deeper than they knew. But the veteran didn't turn around. He stood there like a stone in a rushing river. His hands still clasped behind his back, thumb pressed against that folded card. His gray-blue eyes remained fixed on the stage, on the spot where his son Lucas Cole would soon walk across. The light fell across his face, tracing every line time had carved there. There was something in that stance so still, so resolute, that made Linda want to rise and speak, but her throat locked shut. Another guard approached, voice firmer now. "Sir, if you don't move, we'll have to escort you out." The old man lifted his head and met the young man's eyes, calm, deep, unflinching, like still water in a well. "I'm not causing trouble. I just want to see my son graduate." The guard hesitated. For a brief second, the authority in his voice faltered. He looked away from those eyes that had seen things he couldn't even imagine. But orders were orders. He turned to his partner. "Call for backup." Linda felt heat rush to her face. She looked around. No one moved. Some kept adjusting their cameras. Others laughed at private jokes. In that noise, the silence of the old man became its own sound, sharp, aching, unbearable. She heard herself whisper, barely audible, "This can't be happening." Still, he didn't move. The ceiling lights caught the small insignia on his chest, the eagle globe and anchor, the symbol of the United States Marine Corps. The metal had tarnished with age, but it still glimmered faintly, as though carrying the heartbeat of faraway battlefields. Linda suddenly remembered something her father, also a veteran, once told her. The quiet ones carry the memories no one else is brave enough to hear. And now she was seeing it, that memory standing right in front of her, being pushed aside from a front row seat simply because his name wasn't on a list. He didn't grow angry, not even close. He took a slow breath, steady and deep, and said softly, so softly, it almost vanished into the hum of the crowd. "My son wanted me to be here." The words weren't loud nor sharp yet. They sliced through the polite noise like a calm blade through silk. No one replied. But Linda saw it, the change. A few nearby had stopped laughing. A young woman lowered her head, fixing her dress to avoid his gaze. A middle-aged man coughed as if to mask his discomfort. In that vast hall, the only one who didn't seem to notice the shift was the man himself, the very center of it all. His silence was forcing everyone else to confront their own, because they had just witnessed a man's dignity insulted right there in the same place they came to celebrate intellect and pride. Linda clenched the program in her lap. Her fingers trembled. She knew just one more second, one more careless word, and nothing would ever be the same again. And indeed, that moment came not from him, but from the men sitting quietly in the fifth row. The security guard tightened his grip on the radio in his hand and signaled to his partner. "Sir, please come with me." His tone was firm, polite, but cold. One hand rested on the old man's elbow, a gesture practiced and mechanical, devoid of thought or feeling. The veteran didn't resist. He simply inclined his head slightly, his eyes still fixed on the stage. The overhead light cast deep shadows along the ridges of his face and glinted faintly off the worn brass of the eagle globe, an anchor pinned to his chest. He spoke slowly, his voice rasping like wind moving through old metal. "I won't leave. Not until I see my son walk that stage." The words passed unnoticed in the noise of the hall, but in the fifth row, 6 men lifted their heads almost in unison. No one told them to. There were no orders. Just 6 pairs of eyes meeting the kind of understanding born only in fire and smoke, where a single movement once meant the difference between life and death. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. 6 men rose. The sound was small, barely audible, but Linda Monroe felt it immediately. The air inside the auditorium shifted. The 6 men weren't in uniform. They looked like ordinary guests in shirts and sports jackets, their faces calm, expressionless. Yet there was something unmistakable in the way they stood, something that made the air itself straighten around them. One of them stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered hair, cropped close in a military fade, eyes sharp as glass. He pulled his hand from his pocket and opened his palm. The small object resting there caught the light. It wasn't a police badge. It wasn't an ID. It was a gold insignia with silver wings, the trident of a U.S. Navy SEAL. The guard froze, eyes widening. Then a voice, low, steady, and resonant like a drumbeat rolling through the hall, filled the air. "This man does not leave this room." The sound wasn't loud yet. It reverberated through every row like a command carved into stone. He paused, then continued softer now, almost ceremonial. "He's the man who led us through hell." The words paralyzed the room. The cameras stopped clicking. The laughter died. It was as if someone had pulled the oxygen from the air. The second guard unconsciously let go of the old man's arm. His gaze flickered between the insignia and the speaker's face, and in that instant, he understood that he stood before a wall of history he had no right to touch. The 6 men moved forward. No orders. No words. They simply positioned themselves behind the veteran, not to shield him, not to confront, but to stand as they once had in a place far away, hot, loud, and deadly, where they had survived together. Linda Monroe held her breath. Her spine went cold. What she saw now was no longer a father being disrespected. It was the collision of 2 worlds, one of honor, the other of indifference. And honor had just returned, carrying with it the scent of the battlefield. A whisper began to ripple through the crowd. "SEALs. They're SEALs." The word spread like a wave. People turned their heads. Phones hung motionless mid-air. The old Marine didn't speak. He only bowed his head slightly, shoulders trembling, not with fear, but with something deeper, something like memory. The tall SEAL turned to the guards again. His tone softened, but carried the weight of command. "That man carried us through mud, through fire. If we have to, we'll carry him now." No one dared to answer. Somewhere in the back, a clipboard slipped from a staff member's hand, the clatter echoing sharply before fading into silence. All eyes were fixed on the scene. The air thickened heavy with shame that hadn't yet found its words. Linda's throat tightened. She saw the old man's eyes glimmer beneath the light, not with pride, but with remembrance. In that moment, she understood the power in this room had shifted. It no longer belonged to those with lists reserved seats or microphones. It belonged to men who had walked through death and still chose to stand quietly in defense of another's dignity. No one spoke again. The guard lowered his hands. One of the SEALs stepped forward and placed his hand gently on the veteran's shoulder. That simple gesture, unspoken sacred, told the entire room what words never could. "No one touches him again." From the back, Linda could hear her own heartbeat. The air was so taut that even a breath too loud might shatter it. And then, for the first time, she saw the veteran exhale. A long, slow breath as if releasing the weight of an entire lifetime. The hall remained frozen. No applause, no cheers. Only silence, the kind that comes from reverence, from the realization that everyone had just witnessed something far greater than a graduation ceremony. And within that silence, another voice rose, deep gravelly, commanding from the left side of the room. A man in uniform stood up, and the entire hall held its breath. In the breathless silence of the hall, a rough, aged voice suddenly rose from the left side, raspy yet strong enough to cut through every layer of quiet. I know that man. Every head turned toward the sound. A tall, broad-shouldered man with white hair stood up slowly. His army dress uniform gleamed under the auditorium lights, the rows of ribbons across his chest, catching the glow, each one a story of its own. His posture was straight, his gaze sharp, and his voice carried the steady wind of remembrance like flags moving at a memorial service. That's Master Sergeant Raymond Cole, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Marine Corps. The room went completely still. Not a murmur, not even the sound of a breath. The colonel paused, making sure everyone heard each word clearly, before continuing, his voice now quieter, but heavy with the weight of memory. Kandahar, 2006. I was there. I saw this man run back into a burning compound, through bullets and smoke. He dragged out every Marine trapped inside. 5 of them, all alive. A silence so deep it seemed to vibrate filled the air. You could hear the faint tremble of restrained emotion. The light above seemed to dim, settling only on the face of the Marine, the same man they had tried to remove from the room just minutes earlier. Linda Monroe pressed her hand to her chest. She couldn't tell if she was trembling or crying. The stories she'd heard about heroes, the films, the speeches, all of them paled before the reality standing before her. A man who asked for nothing, demanded no title, only to keep a promise to his son. The colonel turned toward the crowd, his voice now warm but still anchored by the gravity of combat recollection. No one told him to go back. He didn't ask permission. While the rest of us were finding cover, he went in for his brothers. He's the reason I and many others here are still alive today. A cough broke somewhere in the back row, then faded. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Behind him, the 6 Navy SEALs still stood at attention. They didn't need to say a word, the colonel had spoken for them all. Linda looked around the auditorium. The same faces that had been indifferent were now transformed, heads bowed, lips pressed tight, hands clasped. And in the middle of it all, the old Marine stood firm, silent, his eyes softened by the light. Not with pride, not with anger, but with quiet grace. Under the glow of the stage lights, the Marine Corps insignia on his chest shimmered like sacred metal. Every wrinkle on his face looked like an inscription of years, carved by sand smoke and brotherhood long forgotten. Then the colonel slowly bowed his head. His right hand rose to his temple, the motion precise, sharp, deliberate. "Master Sergeant," he said simply, "we salute you." Time stopped. No one could say how long they stood there. And then, as if drawn by instinct, the 6 SEALs behind him raised their right hands in perfect unison. The soft rustle of fabric was the only sound, blending with the steady rhythm of 100 beating hearts. The veteran did not return the salute. He placed his hand over his chest, right where his son's folded note rested. In his eyes was something warm, not pride, but gratitude. He didn't need anyone to stand for him. But at that moment, everyone did. Not out of duty, but out of reverence. Linda saw the first tear fall down the cheek of a young woman in the front row. Then another. Then a whole row. No one hid it. No one was ashamed. They were witnessing something far beyond ceremony or scholarship. The lights on the stage still burned bright, but their focus had changed. They no longer belonged to the graduates, but to an old soldier standing at the edge of the room, the man whose dignity had made the entire hall bow its head. The colonel lowered his salute, his voice now soft, resonant, almost a prayer. He doesn't need a seat to be honored. It's we who must bow our heads to remember him. No one answered. Then slowly, the applause began, gentle at first, then swelling until it filled the room. But it wasn't like any applause before. There were no cheers, no whistles, no celebration. It was the sound of gratitude, the sound of people who had just realized they were standing in the presence of true courage. Linda rose to her feet, her hands trembling, eyes wet. She knew from this moment on, everyone in that hall would remember his name, Master Sergeant Raymond Cole. And just as the applause began to fade, a young man in a graduation gown started to move from the back of the stage. His eyes locked on the old Marine standing by the wall, and in that instant, everyone understood the most sacred moment was still to come. The hall was frozen in silence when a small sound broke from the stage, the scrape of a chair, the hurried steps of someone leaving the line of graduates. Every head turned. A young man in his cap and gown, the black tassel tilted slightly to one side, descended the steps quickly. His hands trembled. His breath came short, but his eyes shone with calm resolve. Linda Monroe recognized him instantly, the student the old man had been watching all morning. On the program in her lap, his name was printed in bold, Lucas Cole. He walked straight to the microphone, bowed briefly to the faculty, then lifted his head to face the crowd. His voice came steady and strong, not loud, not shaking, the kind that carried truth more than volume. "That's my father." The entire auditorium went still. No one moved. Lucas gripped the microphone tighter, leaning slightly forward. His words dropped into the heavy air one by one, each falling like a stone into deep water. The man standing there by the exit. "That's my father. He didn't come here to disturb anyone. He came here because of his son." His voice wavered, then steadied again, carrying a tremor of raw emotion. "I'm proud not because of this diploma today. I'm proud because I bear his name." Linda's throat closed. The air seemed to crack apart, then hold still again. Lucas set the microphone down and stepped away from the podium. The sound of his shoes echoed down the aisle, slow, heavy, deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively, widening a path for him as he walked. No one dared stand in his way. He stopped in front of the silver-haired man. Father and son faced each other beneath the soft light, pouring from above, one face worn and quiet, lined with years of hardship, the other young and trembling, alive with feeling. Lucas took a deep breath. Then, in that perfect stillness, he lifted his hand sharply to his temple, a crisp, flawless military salute. "Sir, I'm proud of you." The words were small, but they struck like thunder. The father didn't return the salute. He didn't move at all, just took one step forward and pulled his son into his arms. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears. Just a firm, grounding embrace, 2 lives, 2 generations bound again by something beyond ceremony, love, and gratitude. The silence was absolute. You could hear the weight of emotion in the breath of every person there. Linda covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. No one applauded. No one spoke. They simply watched, witnessing the simplest, purest act humans are capable of, honoring a father's sacrifice through the son who understood it. Behind them, the 6 seals still stood at attention. One of them nodded slightly. Then, as if obeying an unspoken command deep in their bones, they raised their hands in perfect unison. 6 salutes, 6 stories, 6 living tributes to the man who had once led them through hell. The lighting in the hall shifted softer now, warmer, as though even the fixtures understood that this moment required no spotlight. The father still held his son, his rough hand resting on the boy's back, patting 3 times. Slow, steady, sure. Lucas's voice broke the silence, trembling, but clear. "You don't have to stand in the back anymore, Dad. This seat, this is yours." The old Marine didn't reply. He simply smiled, a quiet, weary smile filled with peace. In that smile lived a lifetime of fatigue, sacrifice, and the grace of seeing his legacy stand before him. Around them, people began to bow their heads, not by instruction, but by instinct. Some of the students removed their caps, placing hands over their hearts. Somewhere in the back, a soft sob echoed, blending into the hush. Linda closed her eyes and whispered through her tears, "That's what honor looks like. No medals, no speeches, just an embrace." Then the graduation music swelled again, but this time it sounded different. No longer triumphant, but reverent, like a hymn of farewell. Even the stage seemed to bow. Father and son turned toward the main aisle. The 6 seals followed behind, still in formation. The front doors opened, and sunlight streamed in, wrapping them in a gentle halo, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness, like redemption. The entire auditorium watched as they walked. No cheers, no cameras flashing. Only silent gazes, the kind that write new definitions of what dignity truly means. Linda gripped the program in her hands, her heart whispering to itself, "If the world still has men like them, then maybe there's still hope." And as the father and son took their seats in the front row, the very row he'd been turned away from minutes before, the hall had barely caught its breath when another figure slowly rose from the back. Something else was about to change, but this time it wouldn't be tears that followed. It would be forgiveness. The ceremony ended in the quiet glow of sunset. Ribbons lay scattered across the floor. The loudspeakers went silent, leaving behind only the faint echo of footsteps. The hall was nearly empty now, the rows of reserved seats vacant, the crowd long gone. Only a few staff members remained tidying up in hushed tones. Yet even in that emptiness, something hung in the air, that rare stillness that follows after people have witnessed something that makes them look inward. Raymond Cole was still seated there, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the empty stage. Beside him, Lucas sat quietly, saying nothing. His eyes were red, but calm. The last light of the day slipped through the tall windows, casting a golden stripe across the worn Marine Corps insignia on Raymond's chest. It glowed faintly soft, steady, unpretentious, like an old lantern still burning out of habit, even when no one was watching. A small group began to approach. They were the staff, the same ones who just that morning had pointed, ordered, and spoken words they now wished they could take back. They walked slowly, heads bowed, their fingers gripping a crumpled sheet of paper, the guest list. Their footsteps were quiet, careful, as if afraid to disturb the gravity that surrounded the silver-haired Marine. The young woman, the one who had said, "This section is for real families," stopped in front of him. Her lips trembled. Her eyes glistened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a dry, broken breath escaped her throat. Raymond looked up at her. His eyes were not stern, not cold. They carried the calm of someone who had seen greater fear than this, and who understood that remorse in itself was a kind of courage. He inclined his head slightly, his voice low but steady, carrying clearly through the empty room. "Don't apologize. Just remember, who built the floor you're standing on?" The words floated like a whisper, yet their weight settled heavily. No one moved. No one dared meet his gaze. The oldest man in the group, perhaps head of security, nodded slowly, his hand trembling. His eyes were wet when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "We'll remember, sir." Raymond nodded once, nothing more. He turned to Lucas and smiled, the small, quiet smile of a father who knows his son has learned the most important lesson: strength doesn't always need to be loud. In the fifth row, Linda Monroe still sat in the same place where it had all begun. Watching this scene, she felt as though she were witnessing a second ceremony, one without a stage, without applause, without an audience. A ceremony of forgiveness. The young woman bowed deeply, then stepped back. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She knew she didn't have to. Forgiveness had already been given in the silence of his gaze, in the absence of judgment, and somehow that silence cut deeper than any reprimand could. Lucas placed a hand on his father's shoulder and said softly, "Today they finally saw you the way I always have." Raymond smiled but didn't answer. He looked toward the window where the evening sky had turned the color of old copper. A flag outside fluttered gently in the wind, and in that moment it no longer felt like a symbol of a nation, but a reminder of the millions who had lived, fought, and come home quietly, just like him. A breeze drifted through the open door, brushing against a program on the table. It flipped open to the last page where a line was printed in small type: "Dedication to service. Devotion to family." Linda read it and thought to herself, yes. And one more thing: forgiveness. No one left right away. They simply stood in place, letting the veteran's silence settle into the air, letting gratitude find its way into their hearts. Finally, Raymond rose to his feet. He turned to the staff and said one last thing, his voice rough but warm. "We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is knowing when to stop and bow our heads." No one replied, but several nodded. A few wiped their eyes. Linda rose too, almost without realizing it, as though afraid to miss this final moment. The old Marine walked slowly toward the door. Behind him, the sound of footsteps followed not those of guards, but of the very people who had once turned him away. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of grass and the distant echo of the national anthem from the field nearby. Raymond stopped, lifted his gaze to the flag waving high, and his eyes softened. In that stillness, it felt as though every grievance in the world had quietly dissolved. Lucas came to stand beside him, hands clasped behind his back, the way his father always did. He asked softly, "Do you think they understand, Dad?" Raymond's voice came low and gentle. "Someday, they will." And as the two of them stepped out into the fading light, the last glow of sunset slipped across the floor, where he had once stood, but in the corner of that empty hall, another kind of light remained. The light of gratitude. The light of memory. A light that would not fade. The auditorium had grown quiet. Rows of empty chairs stood like silent witnesses, scattered with small remnants, fallen papers, wilted boutonnieres, a few graduation caps left behind. The last light of afternoon streamed through the high windows, casting long golden beams across the polished floor, where just an hour ago hundreds had stood shoulder to shoulder. Now only a few people remained, those unwilling to leave while that sacred feeling still lingered in the air. Raymond Cole stood near the aisle. His old marine dress jacket caught the dim light. Every crease, every frayed stitch, every faded button seemed to tell a story without words. He said nothing, only watched. Beside him, Lucas, his son, stood quietly, not as a boy beside his father, but as a soldier beside his commander. Students began to approach one by one, not in a line, not by announcement, just naturally. Each step was slow, deliberate. Each face carried the same look, reverence. A blonde girl, her graduation cap still in her hand, and tears still bright at the corner of her eyes, reached out to clasp his weathered hand. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, "for keeping the promise that gave us this day." He nodded once. No words. Another student, still in his gown, stopped in front of him. Overcome, he straightened his back, lifted his right hand to his temple, and gave a sharp, respectful salute. Raymond met his eyes and returned only a slight nod. Between those two generations, nothing more was needed, no speeches, just understanding. Linda Monroe sat in the 5th row, the very place where everything had begun. She couldn't bring herself to leave. Every movement in front of her felt heavy with meaning, like watching history being rewritten, not with ink, but with silence. More students came. Some offered firm handshakes. Others simply placed a hand on his shoulder before bowing their heads. Each gesture carried an unspoken apology, a quiet act of redemption from a crowd that had once looked away. Then one of the SEALs stepped forward, the youngest of the 6, lean and sharp-eyed, the blue of his eyes bright as water. In his hand he held a small round piece of metal gleaming faintly in the fading light. He stopped in front of Raymond and held it out with both hands like part of a ritual. "Sir," he said softly, "you taught us that war doesn't need noise, only men who know how to stand their ground. This is for you." He placed it gently into Raymond's open palm. It was a challenge coin, the kind given only to those considered the backbone of their unit. On one side was the Navy SEAL insignia, silver wings crossed with an anchor. On the other, engraved in crisp, fine lettering, "The quiet ones lead the loudest wars." Raymond looked down at the coin, the fading light glinting off its surface, reflecting into his eyes. He smiled, just a faint curve of the lips, fleeting and serene. His calloused fingers closed around it, not to keep it, but to feel its weight. Lucas stood beside him and asked quietly, "Dad, do you ever regret it? Coming home and living so quietly after Raymond didn't look at him?" His gaze stayed fixed on the fading light beyond the door. His voice was low, warm, and unwavering. "No. Silence has its own sound. It's just most people don't stop long enough to hear it." Lucas didn't reply. He simply stood closer, his hand resting gently on his father's shoulder, a touch small, but full of pride. Raymond reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the worn card. The folds were frayed, but the blue handwriting remained untouched, Dad. "I want you in the front row." He looked at it one more time, then carefully folded it back and slipped it into its place over his heart. From afar, Linda saw it and felt tears well up again. She understood now some letters are never written to be read aloud. They're meant to be carried like vows, like proof that love and honor need no witnesses to exist. Raymond turned toward the doors. The 6 SEALs were still there, standing like pillars of quiet strength. They no longer needed to protect anyone. They were there to see him off. The youngest among them lifted his hand in one final salute. His fingers trembled slightly as he lowered it. Raymond nodded, returning the gesture. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Outside, the light had softened to a pale gold. Only the last streaks of sun stretched across the wall behind him. The sound of his boots echoed slow, even measured the rhythm of a soldier's final march. No one knew where he went after that day. There were no reports, no interviews, no headlines. But every year when graduation returned, people still spoke of that morning, the day a father stood silently at the back of the room and made the entire room stand for him. Linda later wrote about it, but she didn't embellish a single line. At the end of her piece, she added just one simple sentence: he didn't come for applause. He came to keep a promise. But through his silence, he taught the world how to bow to courage. And so the ceremony ended. But the story did not. Because sometimes heroes don't need battlefields to be remembered. They just need a quiet room and someone willing to listen to the sound of honor. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes,